Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something pretty amazing. How our bodies have actually changed over time to let us live in just about any climate you can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, think about the range from really hot, humid jungles to, freezing cold, high altitude mountains. It's incredible.
It really is. And we've got some great research to walk through. There's a study from University College London on a specific gene that affects hair and sweat.
Right. And another one from the Journal of Physiological Anthropology, looking at how heat messes with our thinking, basically.
And a really comprehensive dissertation that looks at both the genes and the physical shapes, the morphology of populations in the Americas.
So the plan is to sort of unpack what all this tells us about how flexible we really are, how our bodies respond to these environmental extremes.
And why should you, the listener, care? Well, understanding this story isn't just history. It tells us a lot about human resilience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe gives us some perspective on, the climate challenge that we're facing right now. How have we adapted before? What does that tell us?
Okay, let's jump in. That UCL study you mentioned, it's a great starting point because it focuses on one specific genetic change, the EDAR gene.
Yeah, the EDAR gene, and specifically a variation called EDAR V5070A. You find this variant quite a lot in people of East Asian ancestry.
And the really cool part is what this single variant is linked to physically. Thicker hair strands is one thing.
Right. And the other, maybe more relevant for climate adaptation, is a higher number of sweat glands.
More sweat glands. Okay, I can see how that would be useful. How did they figure this out?
Well, they did a few things. First, they just showed the link in people variant equals these traits. Then they used computer modeling, simulations, to estimate when this version of the gene might have popped up.
And when was that?
Their models point to maybe around 30,000 years ago. So, pretty ancient.
Wow, okay. Did they speculate why? What was the advantage?
They did. And it's tricky, right? Because the climate wasn't stable. Before, about 10,000 years ago, it was generally colder, more variable. After that, warmer, more stable.
So thicker hair might be good in the cold.
Uh-huh. And more sweat glands, obviously better for cooling off when it's hot. So the advantage might have actually shifted depending on what the climate was doing. It's hard to pin down which trait was the main driver initially.
And they tested this somehow to make sure the gene really caused the changes.
Yeah, this is clever. They used mice. They engineered mice to have the East Asian version of the EDAR gene.
Yeah.
And those mice developed thicker hair and more sweat glands, just like we see in humans with the variant.
So it confirms the cause and effect.
Pretty much.
Oh.
And it works because the underlying biological pathway, the ectodisplasin pathway, is really old, evolutionarily speaking. It's conserved across lots of animals.
Meaning the basic machinery is similar in mice and humans for this specific thing.
Exactly. So studying it in mice tells us a lot about us.
Okay, so that's a really clear example. One gene variant, visible physical changes, potentially tied to adapting to different climates, whether hot or cold.
Precisely. It sets the stage nicely for thinking about, well, more complex adaptations involving maybe lots of genes working together.
Right. Let's scale up then. How about adapting specifically to heat? What happens when things get hot, and how have some populations maybe genetically adjusted? Let's start with the brain. That sounds intriguing.
Yeah, the study in the Journal of Physiological Anthropology looks right at that cognitive performance, how well you think, when you're exposed to heat.
Okay, what did they do?
They compared two groups of guys living in Japan. One group was originally from tropical Asia, so assumed to be used to the heat, acclimatized. The other group was native Japanese, from a temperate climate,
And they heated them up.
kind of gently. It was passive heat exposure. They put their lower legs in 42 degrees Celsius water while sitting in a room at 28 degrees Celsius, just enough to raise body temp a bit.
Okay, and what happened to their thinking?
Big difference. The tropical group, their core body temperature didn't rise as much. And critically, their scores on the cognitive tests didn't drop. They did fine on a short-term memory test and a mental math test.
But the Japanese group...
Their performance went down, significantly so on the mental arithmetic task. It suggests maybe those more complex mental jobs are more vulnerable to heat stress.
Interesting. Was there anything else?
Yeah, this is really cool. They measured brain activity using NIRS near-infrared spectroscopy, looking at oxygen levels in the prefrontal cortex. Basically a measure of cognitive effort.
Yeah.
Both groups showed increased brain activity when doing the tasks in the heat. They were both trying harder.
There's a but, isn't there?
There is. The Japanese group had to increase their brain activity way more than the tropical group. They were working much harder mentally just to try and keep up, and they still performed worse on the math.
Wow. So the tropical guys didn't just perform better, they did it with less mental strain.
Exactly. Better heat acclimatization meant better resistance to performance loss and less cognitive effort needed. It really shows heat isn't just about feeling uncomfortable. It hits your brain function.
Yeah, you can feel that sometimes on a really hot day trying to concentrate. That's relevant for pretty much everyone listening.
Definitely. So that's the short-term effect. But what about long-term genetic adaptation? For that, we look at the dissertation's work on Mexican Mayan populations.
Right, living in places like Chiapas. Hot, humid, tropical climate.
Extremely so.
Hmm.
The dissertation notes the high heat indices, the risks for people working outside, like dehydration leading to kidney problems. It's a serious environmental pressure.
So did they find genetic clues? How do they even look for that?
They use methods called selection scans. These are statistical tools that look across the whole genome for regions that seem to have changed frequency really quickly in that population compared to others.
Like faster than random genetic drift would explain?
Precisely. A rapid change suggests that variant was really beneficial, that natural selection favored it strongly in that specific environment. They compared the Mayans to Peruvian Quechua and Han Chinese, populations from different climates.
And what did they find in the Mayans for heat adaptation?
They found signals of selection on genes involved in some really key areas. One big one was water and salt balance genes like AKP11 and NEDD4L. Makes perfect sense if you're sweating constantly.
Yeah, managing hydration. What else?
Genes involved in vasodilation, widening blood vessels near the skin to dump heat. BDKRB2 was one.
Okay, cooling mechanism.
And also genes related to the cellular response to heat stress itself, things like BG6, HSPA12A. These are connected to heat shock proteins, which basically protect your cells when they get too hot.
Like internal bodyguards for your cells?
Kinda, yeah. And they also found signals related to thyroid hormones, the DOX family, TPO, and even genes involved in fat metabolism, like PPARG. These systems are all interconnected in managing energy and body temp.
So it's not just one thing, it's a whole suite of adaptations working together.
Exactly. It's selection acting on pathways related to thermoregulation, water balance, cellular protection, a clear genetic signature of adapting to that hot, humid environment.
Okay, fascinating. Let's flip that completely. What about the opposite extreme? Cold, dry, high altitude, like the Andes. The dissertation looked there too, right? At Peruvian Quechua.
Yes, in places like Cerro de Pasco, really high up. And this environment throws multiple challenges at you at once.
More than just cold.
Oh, yeah. You've got the intense cold, obviously,
Mm.
but also hypoxia, low oxygen because the air is thin. It's also incredibly dry, arid, and intense UV radiation from the sun.
And you mentioned earlier the hypoxia makes the cold worse.
Right. It can actually hinder your body's ability to shiver effectively and can increase heat loss. So your body is fighting multiple battles.
So did they find genetic adaptations here too, using those same scan methods?
They did. And the results reflect that multi-pronged challenge. For the cold specifically, they found selection signals on genes linked to brown adipose tissue, BAT.
Brown fat. Isn't that the stuff that generates heat?
Exactly. It's crucial for non-shivering thermogenesis, basically making heat internally without muscle contraction. ZNF516 was one gene implicated. Others were related to cold-induced heat production and cellular responses to cold.
Okay, so turning up the internal furnace.
Pretty much. And some of these genes, like TAAD, have popped up in studies of other cold-adapted populations too, suggesting some common strategies.
What about the altitude, the low oxygen?
Key genes there. They found signals near HIF1A that's a master regulator of the body's response to hypoxia. Really well-known altitude studies. Others like PAM and PSMA4 too. And again, genes for vasodilation like BRKG1 and BDKRB2 helping get that precious oxygenated blood delivered.
BDKRB2 again. That came up in the heat adaptation too.
It did. Suggests vasodilation control is crucial in both extremes, maybe for different reasons or balances.
And the dryness, the aridity.
Yep, adaptations for that too. Genes involved in water balance, fluid homeostasis, AKR1B1, CLDN4, and look, NEDD4L shows up again.
The water and salt balance gene from the Mayans.
The very same. Clearly important for managing fluids, whether you're losing them to heat or to dry air.
Okay, so cold, hypoxia, aridity. What about UV?
Signals related to pigmentation and protecting against UV damage were also found. And those thyroid genes, DWX, TPO, they're back again too.
Why thyroid here?
The thyroid axis gets activated at high altitude, and thyroid hormones also play a role in regulating temperature in the cold. So it makes sense it's under selection here.
Wow, so it's like a whole genetic toolkit specifically tailored for Andean survival, better heating, better oxygen use, better water management, UV protection.
It really is a beautiful example of adaptation to a complex, challenging environment.
Okay, so we've talked genes, these invisible changes, but adaptation can also be about visible physical form, right? Like
Yeah,
our faces. The dissertation touched on that too.
it did. This part compared the actual physical shape, the craniofacial structure, of the Peruvian Quechua and the Mexican Mayans.
How do they measure faces so precisely?
They use a technique called digital facial stereophotogrammetry. It creates highly accurate 3D models of faces, allowing them to measure specific distances and shapes using landmarks.
Very high tech. So comparing the Quechua from the cold, dry Andes and the Mayans from the hot, humid tropics, what were the facial differences, specifically around the nose, I guess?
Exactly, the midface was key. They found the Peruvian Quechua tended to have a longer nasal ridge, the top part of the nose, and a taller bony opening for the nose compared to the Mayans.
So overall, a longer nose structure, top to bottom.
Essentially, yes, a longer external nasal profile. They also found the maxilla, the upper jaw area right under the nose, was positioned a bit more forward in the Quechua.
Pushing the whole mid-face out slightly.
A little, yeah. Though interestingly, the actual cartilaginous tip of the nose might not project out more and might even be a bit downturned relative to the overall longer structure.
Okay. Why would that be adaptive? What's the connection to the cold, dry Andean air?
Well, think about what your nose does. It warms and humidifies the air you breathe in. If you're breathing freezing, dry air, having a longer, taller internal nasal passage gives the air more time and more surface area to get warmed up and moistened before it hits your lungs.
Ah, right. Protects the lungs. It's like a built-in air conditioner, but in reverse, a heater and humidifier.
Exactly that. Breathing that kind of air directly into the lungs would be damaging. So this morphology, this shape, seems consistent with an adaptation to condition the inhaled air.
Makes perfect sense. Were there other facial differences?
They did find differences between males and females, as you'd expect, but those were separate from these population-level differences linked to climate.
Now, did they connect these specific face shapes back to the specific genes they found under selection?
That's the crucial next step they didn't take in this particular study. The physical differences align really well with the adaptation idea, and the genetics point to adaptation happening.
But linking specific gene A causes specific nose shape B, that's harder.
Much harder. You need more research for those direct genotype-phenotype links. And you always have to consider other possibilities like random genetic drift or maybe non-genetic developmental effects of the environment, although the pattern here strongly suggests adaptation.
Still, putting the genetic evidence alongside the physical evidence makes a pretty compelling story.
Absolutely. It shows human populations really do change biologically and physically in response to where they live, and relatively quickly in evolutionary terms.
Okay, let's pull this together. We've taken quite the journey. We saw how even a single gene variant, like for EDAR, can affect traits like hair and sweat, potentially helping with climate adaptation.
Yeah, then we saw how heat impacts thinking, but how acclimatization helps, and how Mexican Mayans showed genetic selection for managing heat, water, and salt in hot climates.
And then the flip side, the amazing genetic toolkit of the Peruvian Quechua, adapted to the combined challenges of cold, thin air, and dryness in the Andes. Better heating, better oxygen handling, better water balance.
And finally, how these adaptations might even be reflected in visible differences, like facial structure, possibly helping to condition that harsh Andean air.
The big picture from all this research seems to be, well, that humans are remarkably adaptable. Evolution hasn't stopped. Our bodies have continued to change in response to the environment.
It's powerful evidence for ongoing human evolution, driven by environmental pressures happening over timescales of maybe just thousands of years.
Okay, so that leaves us with a pretty big final thought, doesn't it? If our biology could adapt like this to major climate differences in the past, what about now? We're changing the climate globally and incredibly fast, much faster than the changes these populations adapted to.
Right. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Can our biological evolution keep up with the pace of human-caused climate change? Or how much will we need to rely on our culture, our technology, our behavior to navigate what's coming?
Something definitely worth thinking about.